A tired waitress boards a red-eye flight after her long shift at the diner. When both pilots collapse at 30,000 feet, passengers dismiss her as just another service worker. They don't know she's a former airline pilot, and she's their only hope to survive. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning shift at Ruby's roadside diner had been particularly brutal, with Sarah Mitchell's feet aching from 13 straight hours of shuttling plates between the kitchen and booths filled with truck drivers, families, and the occasional businessman who'd taken a wrong exit off the interstate. Her polyester uniform, a faded maroon dress with a white apron that had seen better days, still carried the lingering scent of coffee and bacon grease as she settled into seat 23C aboard Transcontinental Airlines Flight 447, a Boeing 737-800 bound from Phoenix to Boston. The red-eye departure at 11:45 meant she'd be arriving just in time to catch a few hours of sleep before her next shift started at Ruby's sister location near her apartment in Dorchester. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool window as the aircraft pushed back from the gate, watching ground crew members in their reflective vests guide the plane toward the taxiway while her exhausted mind wandered through the familiar choreography of pre-flight procedures she once knew by heart but now observed only as a passenger among 178 others. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration with practiced efficiency, and Sarah noticed the woman in seat 23B, an impeccably dressed attorney named Jennifer Rawlings, judging by the briefcase at her feet, glanced sideways with a polite but slightly pitying smile at Sarah's worn uniform and the grease stain near her collar that hadn't quite come out in the wash. Jennifer's Armani suit and leather portfolio projected the kind of professional success that made Sarah's current circumstances feel even more crushing, though the attorney couldn't possibly know that the tired waitress beside her had once commanded a Boeing 767 across the Atlantic, or that Sarah's logbook, now gathering dust in a storage unit she could barely afford, contained over 4,000 hours of commercial flight time accumulated during a career that had ended 3 years ago in a perfect storm of personal tragedy and institutional cruelty. When the flight attendant, a perky blonde named Ashley, paused at their row to offer pre-departure beverages, she addressed Jennifer with warm professionalism but gave Sarah a sympathetic nod that suggested she recognized a fellow service worker, someone who understood the exhaustion of standing all day and the particular kind of invisibility that comes from wearing a uniform that marks you as someone who serves rather than someone who commands. Captain Marcus Thompson and First Officer David Chen completed their pre-flight checks in the cockpit, running through the familiar litany of switches, gauges, and computer systems that would keep Flight 447 safe during its 5-hour journey across the continent. Thompson, a veteran pilot with 23 years at Transcontinental, had flown this route hundreds of times and looked forward to the relatively quiet red-eye that would end with him sleeping most of the day Thursday before taking his daughter to her soccer game that evening. Chen, younger and less experienced but thoroughly competent, had joined Transcontinental only 18 months earlier after completing his training at a regional carrier, and he felt grateful every day for the opportunity to fly modern jets rather than the aging turboprops he'd started on. Neither pilot could have known that the catered meal they'd consumed during their layover in Phoenix, a chicken pasta dish prepared by a contractor whose food safety protocols had catastrophically failed, had been contaminated with a particularly aggressive strain of salmonella that was already multiplying in their digestive systems as Flight 447 accelerated down runway 25 right and lifted into the Arizona night sky. Sarah felt the familiar surge of acceleration press her back into the seat, and despite everything, despite the 3 years of serving coffee and clearing tables and pretending that her aviation career had never existed, she couldn't suppress the small thrill that came with feeling an aircraft rotate and climb. Her hands, calloused now from carrying heavy trays and scrubbing counters, instinctively moved through phantom motions of the takeoff sequence as she'd performed it countless times before her world had collapsed. The divorce had come first, after Robert had grown tired of her flight schedule and found comfort with his secretary in a cliché so perfect it would have been funny if it hadn't destroyed Sarah's family. Then her mother's cancer diagnosis, requiring constant care and medical bills that consumed Sarah's savings with terrifying speed. The final blow had come when she'd failed her routine medical examination, with the FAA physician noting irregularities in her EKG that required extensive cardiac testing before he could renew her first-class medical certificate. The tests had eventually cleared her heart completely, but by then she'd missed too much work. Transcontinental had terminated her employment during the medical leave, and other airlines viewed her interrupted service and medical history as red flags that made her effectively unemployable in an industry where thousands of qualified pilots competed for every opening. The seatbelt sign chimed off as Flight 447 reached its initial cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, and passengers around Sarah began the familiar rituals of air travel, retrieving laptops and tablets, adjusting reading lights, and settling into their chosen methods of passing the next 5 hours. Jennifer pulled out a legal brief and began making notes with an expensive fountain pen, occasionally glancing at Sarah with the kind of benign curiosity that educated professionals sometimes direct toward service workers, perhaps wondering about the life circumstances that lead someone to spend their days carrying plates and refilling coffee cups. Sarah noticed the look and felt the familiar mixture of shame and anger that had become her constant companion since losing everything she'd worked so hard to achieve. Her pilot's license, now expired because she couldn't afford the medical examination required for renewal, remained in her wallet behind her driver's license and her Ruby's employee ID card, a reminder of who she'd been before circumstances had reduced her to asking strangers whether they wanted their eggs scrambled or over easy. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson felt the first stirrings of nausea approximately 45 minutes into the flight as Flight 447 maintained its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet over the mountains of New Mexico. He attributed the discomfort initially to the coffee he'd consumed during the layover, perhaps brewed too strong or left too long on the burner, and he focused his attention on the aircraft systems and the peaceful night sky visible through the cockpit windows. First Officer Chin experienced his first symptoms 10 minutes later, a sudden cramping in his abdomen that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat and reach for the water bottle stowed beside his flight bag. Neither pilot immediately connected their symptoms to the contaminated meal they'd shared 3 hours earlier, and neither wanted to alarm the other by mentioning what seemed like minor digestive upset that would likely pass. The salmonella was working with devastating efficiency, however, multiplying in their systems and releasing toxins that would soon overwhelm both men simultaneously in the kind of dual-crew incapacitation that aviation safety experts consider one of the most catastrophic scenarios possible at altitude. Sarah had dozed fitfully for perhaps 30 minutes when raised voices from the forward galley penetrated her exhausted consciousness and pulled her back to wakefulness. Through the gap between seats she could see Ashley and another flight attendant, an older woman named Patricia, engaged in what appeared to be an urgent conversation, their professional composure cracking to reveal genuine concern. Ashley disappeared into the cockpit, and Sarah felt a flutter of unease that her aviation training immediately recognized as significant because flight attendants don't interrupt pilots during cruise unless something is genuinely wrong. The atmosphere in the cabin remained calm, with most passengers absorbed in their entertainment or sleeping, but Sarah's heightened awareness picked up the subtle tension radiating from the crew as Ashley emerged from the cockpit with her face pale and immediately picked up the intercom handset with trembling fingers. The announcement shattered the peaceful monotony of the red-eye flight with words that Sarah had never heard during her entire aviation career and had prayed she never would. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a medical emergency. We need any passenger with flight experience to identify themselves immediately to the cabin crew. I repeat, if you have any experience flying aircraft, please press your call button now." The cabin erupted in confused murmuring as passengers exchanged worried glances and Jennifer turned to Sarah with wide eyes, asking what could possibly require such an announcement, but Sarah was already unbuckling her seatbelt and pressing her call button while her heart hammered against her ribs and her mind raced through the terrifying implications. Both pilots incapacitated simultaneously was so statistically improbable that it barely warranted discussion in training scenarios, yet here it was happening in real time at 37,000 feet with 179 lives hanging in the balance, and Sarah realized with horrifying clarity that her waitress uniform and expired credentials might be all that stood between these people and certain death. Ashley appeared at Sarah's row within seconds, her professional mask barely concealing her panic as she took in Sarah's rumpled diner uniform and tired appearance, clearly hoping for someone who looked more like a pilot and less like someone who'd spent the day serving hash browns and clearing tables. Sarah stood and spoke quickly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm a commercial pilot, or I was. For 1,000 hours, type rated on Boeing 737 and 767. My medical certificate is expired and I haven't flown in 3 years, but I know these aircraft systems and procedures. What's the situation? Ashley's expression cycled rapidly through disbelief, desperate hope, and calculation before she grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the front of the aircraft, speaking rapidly as they moved. Both pilots are unconscious. Captain Thompson collapsed about 5 minutes ago, violent vomiting, and then he just passed out. First Officer Chen tried to call for help, but he went down too before he could finish. They're both breathing but completely unresponsive and we can't wake them up. The cockpit door swung open and Sarah stepped into the flight deck for the first time in 3 years, and despite the emergency, despite the fear and adrenaline and the weight of responsibility crashing down on her shoulders, she felt a profound sense of coming home as her eyes swept across the familiar layout of instruments and displays that had once been her office and her domain. Captain Thompson lay slumped in the left seat, his face ashen and covered in sweat, while First Officer Chen had been pulled from the right seat and lay on the cockpit floor where Patricia was monitoring his breathing. The autopilot was engaged and keeping Flight 447 at altitude, but Sarah knew that the aircraft's automation could maintain level flight indefinitely yet couldn't land itself, and eventually the fuel would run out and the aircraft would simply fall from the sky unless someone took control. She stepped over Chen's unconscious form and slid into the right seat, her hands moving automatically to adjust the seat position and fasten the harness while her eyes scanned the primary flight display and navigation systems to assess their current situation. Flight 447 was cruising at 37,000 feet over eastern New Mexico, approximately 600 miles from their destination of Boston Logan International Airport, with sufficient fuel for another 4 hours of flight time based on the gauges Sarah rapidly assessed. The autopilot was maintaining heading and altitude perfectly, and all aircraft systems showed normal operation, which meant the emergency was purely medical rather than mechanical, and the aircraft itself was completely flyable for anyone who knew how. Sarah's fingers found the radio panel and she switched to the frequency displayed on the active communication radio, keying the microphone and forcing her voice to remain calm and professional. Albuquerque Center, Transcontinental 447, we have an emergency situation. Both pilots are incapacitated, medical emergency, unconscious. I'm a passenger with commercial pilot experience taking control of the aircraft. We're currently level at flight level 370 and need immediate assistance. The response came within seconds, the air traffic controller's voice betraying only the slightest hint of stress despite the unprecedented situation unfolding. Transcontinental 447, Albuquerque Center copies your emergency. Confirm both pilots incapacitated and aircraft is being flown by a passenger. What is your pilot qualification and rating? Sarah took a breath and delivered the answer she knew would sound inadequate. I'm a former transcontinental pilot, Boeing 737 and 767 type rated with over 4,000 hours commercial time. My medical certificate is expired and I'm not current, but I'm qualified on this aircraft type and familiar with all systems and procedures. Request vectors for emergency landing at nearest suitable airport. The controller's response came quickly, his professionalism overriding any doubt. 447, understood. Stand by for airport recommendations. We're coordinating with transcontinental operations and emergency services. Maintain current altitude and heading while we set up your approach. Behind Sarah, the cockpit had filled with people as word spread through the cabin about what was happening, and she could feel their eyes on her rumpled waitress uniform and hear their whispered doubts about whether someone who looked like she served coffee for a living could possibly save their lives. Jennifer Rawlings stood in the doorway with her hand covering her mouth, her earlier condescension replaced by terror as she struggled to reconcile the exhausted waitress from seat 23B with the woman now occupying the first officer's seat and speaking in calm, professional tones to air traffic control. Ashley was explaining the situation to other passengers pressing forward, her voice rising as she tried to maintain order. She's a pilot, she used to fly for Transcontinental, she knows what she's doing, everyone needs to return to their seats and let her concentrate. The skepticism in their voices was palpable, the disbelief that their survival depended on someone who looked like she should be asking whether they wanted more coffee rather than flying a commercial airliner. But Sarah blocked out their doubt and focused on the instruments before her and the muscle memory that 3 years of serving tables hadn't erased. The controller came back with recommendations. 447, we show Albuquerque International as your closest suitable airport, approximately 130 miles at your 2 o'clock position. However, Denver International may be preferable given the longer runways and better emergency facilities. Denver is approximately 250 miles at your 11 o'clock. What is your preference for emergency landing? Sarah considered the options rapidly, weighing her rust and uncertainty against the needs of the incapacitated pilots who required immediate medical attention. Albuquerque was closer and would get Thompson and Chen to medical care faster, but Denver had longer runways, more emergency equipment, and if she botched the approach there would be more room for error. She made her decision. Albuquerque Center, 447 will proceed to Albuquerque. Request immediate vectors and weather information. I want to get these pilots on the ground for medical attention as quickly as possible. The controller acknowledged and began providing vectors to turn Flight 447 toward Albuquerque, and Sarah disengaged the autopilot with a deliberate motion that felt both terrifying and exhilarating as she took manual control of the aircraft for the first time in 3 years. The Boeing 737 responded to her inputs exactly as she remembered, the controls firm and precise as she banked gently to the heading provided by air traffic control. Around her, the cockpit instruments displayed information in the familiar Boeing format she'd studied and internalized during thousands of hours of flight time, and despite her terror and the weight of responsibility, Sarah felt her training take over as her hands and mind fell into patterns established through years of professional practice. She began the descent checklist from memory, knowing that bringing Flight 447 down from 37,000 feet to landing elevation at Albuquerque would require careful management of speed, altitude, and aircraft systems while coordinating with air traffic control and preparing passengers for an emergency landing. Patricia appeared at Sarah's shoulder with an update on the pilots. They're both still unconscious but breathing regularly. Whatever hit them hit hard and fast. I've seen food poisoning before but nothing like this. Sarah nodded without taking her eyes from the instruments. Keep monitoring them and make sure they're secure for landing. Once we're on the ground they'll need immediate transport to the hospital. Have the flight attendants prepare the cabin for emergency landing, full brace position and review of emergency exit procedures. I want everyone ready in case this doesn't go perfectly. Patricia's voice held newfound respect as she acknowledged the orders, the condescension that Sarah had endured as a waitress replaced by the recognition that the woman in the right seat was no longer someone who served tables but rather someone on whom all their lives depended. The descent into Albuquerque required Sarah to manage a complex sequence of speed reductions, altitude changes, and configuration modifications while maintaining contact with air traffic control and monitoring fuel consumption and aircraft systems. Her hands moved across the controls with increasing confidence as muscle memory reasserted itself, though she could feel the rust in her procedures and occasionally had to search for switches or controls that had once been second nature. The controller cleared them for descent to 10,000 feet and provided vectors that would position Flight 447 for a straight-in approach to runway 8, and Sarah acknowledged while beginning the aircraft's descent by reducing power and allowing the nose to drop slightly below the horizon. The Boeing 737 responded smoothly, and Sarah cross-checked her rate of descent against the altitude she needed to lose, making minor adjustments to maintain an optimal descent profile that would have them at approach altitude with sufficient distance to configure the aircraft for landing. As Flight 447 descended through 20,000 feet, Sarah called for the approach briefing and began verbalizing the plan for landing despite having no first officer conscious to respond, speaking aloud to organize her own thoughts and establish the mental framework she would need. Approach will be ILS runway 8 at Albuquerque, will configure at standard positions during the approach, plan for flaps 30 landing. Auto brake 3, expect landing weight around 130,000 pounds which puts our approach speed at approximately 140 knots. We have emergency equipment standing by and I'm treating this as an overweight landing given we still have most of our fuel on board, so expect possible inspection after landing but the aircraft should handle it fine within limits. Behind her, Ashley and the other flight attendants were preparing the cabin, demonstrating brace positions to nervous passengers and reviewing emergency exit procedures while trying to project calm confidence despite their own terror. The controller's voice provided steady guidance as Flight 447 continued its descent toward Albuquerque. 447, descend and maintain 7,000 feet, reduce speed to 250 knots, you're currently 25 miles from the field. Albuquerque weather is clear, winds 270 at 8 knots, altimeter 3012. Emergency equipment is positioned and standing by. You're cleared for ILS approach runway 8, contact tower on 118.3 when established on the localizer. Sarah read back the clearance with precision, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut as the reality of what she was attempting crashed over her in waves. She was about to attempt to land a Boeing 737 after 3 years away from the cockpit, with no co-pilot to back her up, with 179 lives depending on her rust-covered skills and expired credentials, and if she made even a small error in the approach or landing it could result in a catastrophe that would dwarf the medical emergency that had started this nightmare. The localizer needle came alive on the primary flight display as Flight 447 approached the extended centerline of runway 8, and Sarah made small corrections to align the aircraft with the electronic guidance that would lead them to the runway threshold. She began configuring the aircraft for landing, calling for flaps in increments while monitoring the airspeed and adjusting power to maintain the proper approach speed for each configuration. The landing gear extended with 3 solid thumps that Sarah felt through the airframe, and the green indicator lights confirmed all 3 landing gear were down and locked. Flight 447 was now committed to landing at Albuquerque, and Sarah ran through her mental checklist of critical items while her hands made constant small adjustments to keep the aircraft precisely on the glide path depicted on her instruments. Jennifer Rawlings sat rigid in seat 23B, watching the darkness outside give way to the approaching lights of Albuquerque below, and thought about the waitress she'd dismissed just hours earlier as nothing more than another service worker worthy of polite but distant acknowledgement. That same woman now controlled their fate with hands that had recently carried plates and coffee pots but were currently flying an airliner with apparent competence toward an emergency landing that would either save or end all their lives. Jennifer felt ashamed of her earlier assumptions and superiority, recognizing that her expensive education and professional success meant nothing in this moment compared to the hard-won expertise of someone she'd considered beneath her attention. Around the cabin, 177 other passengers waited with similar thoughts, their lives in the hands of someone whose appearance and occupation had marked her as unremarkable and ordinary until circumstances revealed the extraordinary skills hidden beneath her humble exterior. Sarah established Flight 447 on the glide slope at 6 miles from the runway, and the aircraft began its final descent toward the ground with all systems configured for landing. Her eyes moved in a familiar scan pattern between the primary flight display, the approach instruments, and the forward view through the windscreen where the runway lights of Albuquerque International Airport stretched into the distance like a string of pearls. She made power adjustments to maintain the proper descent rate, focusing intensely on keeping the aircraft exactly on the electronic glide path while monitoring airspeed to ensure they wouldn't arrive too fast or too slow. At 500 feet above ground level, the automated voice of the ground proximity system began calling out altitude in steady intervals: 500, 400, 300. Sarah's hands tightened on the controls as the runway rushed up to meet them, and at 50 feet she began the landing flare, pulling back gently on the control column to raise the nose and slow the descent rate for touchdown. The main landing gear kissed the runway with a slight chirp of rubber on concrete, and Sarah immediately deployed the speed brakes and thrust reversers while applying steady pressure to the brake pedals. Flight 447 decelerated rapidly along runway 8 at Albuquerque, and Sarah maintained directional control with small rudder inputs as the aircraft slowed through 80 knots, 60 knots, 40 knots, and finally came to a complete stop on the runway with emergency vehicles already converging from their staging positions. The relief that flooded through Sarah's body was so intense she felt momentarily lightheaded, but she forced herself to complete the shutdown procedures, setting the parking brake and beginning the process of securing the aircraft systems. Behind her, the cabin erupted in spontaneous applause and cheering as passengers realized they were safely on the ground, alive because a waitress had possessed skills they'd never imagined lay beneath her humble appearance. Emergency medical personnel rushed aboard Flight 447 within minutes, and Captain Thompson and First Officer Chen were quickly stabilized and transported to the hospital where doctors would determine they'd both suffered severe salmonella poisoning from the contaminated meal in Phoenix. Sarah remained in the cockpit completing paperwork and coordinating with transcontinental operations, and she was still sitting in the right seat when the chief pilot from Transcontinental's Denver base arrived at the aircraft 2 hours later. Gerald Morrison had flown with Sarah years earlier when they'd both been based in Phoenix, and his face showed genuine emotion as he approached her with hand extended. "Sarah Mitchell. I heard it was you, but I almost couldn't believe it. My God, woman, you saved 179 lives tonight. That was textbook flying under impossible circumstances." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the emergency began, and her voice cracked as she responded, "I'm not current, Jerry. My medical certificate expired 2 years ago and I couldn't afford the tests to renew it. I shouldn't have even been in this seat legally, but there was nobody else and those people needed someone who knew how to fly this airplane." Morrison shook his head emphatically. "Legal be damned, you're a pilot and you did what pilots do. You saved lives when nobody else could. The FAA already knows what happened and there won't be any certificate action, I can promise you that. More importantly, Transcontinental wants to talk to you about reinstatement. We need pilots like you, Sarah, pilots who remember what this job really means." The investigation that followed would determine that the catering contractor in Phoenix had failed multiple food safety protocols and that Captain Thompson and First Officer Chen had been the unfortunate victims of a contamination incident that could have ended in tragedy if not for Sarah's presence aboard Flight 447. The media coverage transformed Sarah overnight from an unknown waitress into a national hero, with her story resonating because it confirmed what people wanted to believe about hidden potential and the dignity of all work regardless of status. Television interviews and newspaper profiles detailed her fall from commercial aviation to serving tables at Ruby's roadside diner, and public sympathy for her circumstances generated a groundswell of support that Transcontinental couldn't ignore even if they'd wanted to. The airline reinstated Sarah with full seniority and pay, covering the cost of her medical examination, which confirmed what the doctors had told her years earlier. The EKG irregularities were benign and posed no risk to her ability to safely operate aircraft. Her first-class medical certificate was renewed without restriction, and Sarah found herself back in the left seat of a Boeing 737 just 3 months after Flight 447's emergency landing, this time as a captain rather than a first officer because Transcontinental's management recognized that someone who could safely land an aircraft under those circumstances deserved command authority. Ruby's roadside diner held a farewell party for her last shift, and Sarah left generous tips for her former co-workers who still faced the daily grind of serving food and dealing with the casual dismissals and condescension that she now understood from bitter experience. Jennifer Rawlings wrote Sarah a long letter of apology for her assumptions and prejudice, acknowledging that her education and professional success had blinded her to the possibility that extraordinary people could be found in ordinary circumstances, working ordinary jobs because life had dealt them extraordinary setbacks. Sarah kept the letter in her flight bag as a reminder that appearance and occupation reveal nothing about a person's capabilities, worth, or the journey that brought them to any particular moment. The passengers of Flight 447 formed an association that met annually to commemorate their survival, and they always invited Sarah to speak about her experience, though she found it difficult to articulate the complex emotions of that night when she'd climbed into the right seat wearing a waitress uniform and saved 179 lives through skills that society had dismissed as irrelevant because they'd been dormant and hidden beneath a veneer of economic hardship. Captain Thompson and First Officer Chen both recovered fully from their food poisoning and returned to flying within 6 weeks, and they made a point of seeking Sarah out to thank her personally for saving their lives along with everyone else aboard Flight 447. Thompson told her that he remembered very little of the emergency itself, only the onset of symptoms and then waking up in the hospital, but he'd reviewed the cockpit voice recordings and flight data and concluded that her flying had been exceptional given the circumstances and her time away from the profession. Chen, younger and more emotional, simply hugged Sarah and told her she was the reason his daughter still had a father, and that he would never forget that a waitress he'd never met had possessed the courage and skill to do what needed doing when everyone else was helpless. The Federal Aviation Administration conducted a formal review of the incident and concluded that Sarah's actions had been necessary and appropriate given the emergency circumstances, and that her expired medical certificate was irrelevant because the alternative would have been the certain deaths of everyone aboard when Flight 447 eventually exhausted its fuel and crashed. The FAA used the incident as a case study in crew incapacitation training, emphasizing that pilot skills decay slowly even with years away from flying and that qualified pilots should never hesitate to intervene in emergencies regardless of their current certification status. Sarah participated in several FAA training seminars, describing her experience and encouraging other pilots who'd left the profession due to economic hardship or medical issues to maintain their skills and knowledge because circumstances might someday require them to use that expertise in ways they'd never imagined. The catering contractor in Phoenix faced massive fines and eventual bankruptcy after the investigation revealed systemic food safety violations that had contributed to Thompson and Chen's salmonella poisoning, and new regulations were implemented requiring more stringent oversight of airline food preparation to prevent similar incidents. Transcontinental settled quietly with the families of passengers who'd suffered emotional trauma from the emergency, and the airline implemented new protocols for dual-crew incapacitation that included more aggressive efforts to identify passenger pilots early in flight so cabin crew would know who to contact if needed. Sarah participated in developing those protocols, drawing on her experience to emphasize that qualified pilots might not look like pilots if they'd been forced into other occupations by circumstances beyond their control. The story of Flight 447 resonated far beyond aviation circles, becoming a cultural touchstone about the danger of assumptions based on appearance and occupation, and about the hidden expertise that exists throughout society among people working jobs that society considers menial or unskilled because economic necessity forced them into positions beneath their qualifications. Sarah received hundreds of letters from people in similar circumstances, former professionals working service industry jobs because their careers had been derailed by medical issues, family emergencies, discrimination, or simple bad luck, and she tried to respond to each one with encouragement and the message that their dignity and worth remained intact regardless of their current employment. Some of those correspondents were pilots like her, forced out of aviation by circumstances and working other jobs while hoping for another chance to return to the profession they loved, and Sarah worked with advocacy groups to help them navigate the complex process of restoring medical certificates and finding employment with airlines willing to look past interrupted careers. 3 years after the emergency landing at Albuquerque, Sarah was promoted to check airman, responsible for evaluating and training other pilots at Transcontinental, and she brought to that role a unique perspective born from having lost everything and clawed her way back. She was particularly attentive to pilots facing medical issues or personal circumstances that threatened their careers, remembering her own desperation and the feeling of watching her professional identity dissolve while she served hash browns and refilled coffee cups at Ruby's roadside diner. Her story became part of Transcontinental's culture, a reminder that everyone deserved respect regardless of their current circumstances because today's waitress might be tomorrow's hero if fate provided the opportunity for hidden skills to emerge. The passengers of Flight 447 never forgot that their survival had depended on someone they dismissed as just another service worker, someone whose tired appearance and rumpled uniform had marked her as unremarkable until the moment she revealed herself as extraordinary. Many of them changed their behavior afterward, treating service workers with greater respect and recognition that appearance reveals nothing about a person's journey, capabilities, or the circumstances that brought them to any particular moment. Jennifer Rawlings became a vocal advocate for worker dignity and protection, using her legal skills to represent service industry workers in discrimination cases and always remembering the waitress from seat 23B who'd possessed skills and courage that Jennifer's education and professional success could never match. Sarah continued flying for Transcontinental for another 15 years before retiring as one of the airline's most respected senior captains, and she never forgot the lessons learned during those 3 years serving tables at Ruby's roadside diner. She kept her old waitress uniform in her closet as a reminder of where she'd been and what she'd overcome, and sometimes when she encountered condescension or dismissive treatment from people who judged others by appearance or occupation, she would think about Flight 447 and smile, knowing that circumstances can reveal the extraordinary in anyone if fate provides the opportunity. The story of how a waitress saved 179 lives at 30,000 feet became aviation legend, retold in training courses and safety seminars as an example of why pilots should never judge others by appearance and why expertise remains intact even when buried beneath economic hardship and the grinding reality of working jobs that society considers beneath those who possess it. On the 20th anniversary of Flight 447's emergency landing, the passengers held their largest reunion yet at a hotel in Albuquerque, and they presented Sarah with a plaque commemorating her heroism and thanking her for the gift of life she'd given them on that terrifying night. Sarah accepted the plaque with tears in her eyes and told them that she'd only done what needed doing, what any pilot would have done in those circumstances, but she thanked them for seeing past her waitress uniform to recognize the person beneath. She told them that everyone carries hidden depths and unexpected capabilities, that society's judgments about worth and value based on occupation or appearance are fundamentally wrong, and that the real lesson of Flight 447 was that extraordinary people are everywhere if we have the wisdom to look past surface appearances and recognize their humanity. The Boeing 737 that had been Flight 447 flew for another decade before being retired and sent to an aviation museum in Phoenix, and the museum placed a plaque near the aircraft describing the emergency and Sarah's role in saving everyone aboard. School groups touring the museum would stand before the retired aircraft and learn about the waitress who became a hero, and teachers used the story to emphasize that everyone deserves respect regardless of their current circumstances because hidden beneath ordinary appearances might be extraordinary capabilities waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Sarah visited the museum once, standing before the aircraft she'd landed on that unforgettable night, and she placed her hand on the fuselage in a gesture that encompassed gratitude, grief for what she'd lost, and pride in what she'd accomplished when circumstances demanded everything she had to give. The story of Flight 447 endured because it touched something fundamental about human potential and the danger of assumptions, about how economic circumstances and life's cruel randomness can force qualified professionals into positions society deems lesser, and about how appearance reveals nothing about the journey that brought anyone to any particular moment. Sarah Mitchell had been a pilot, then a waitress, then a pilot again, and those transitions had taught her that dignity inheres in people rather than positions, that worth doesn't depend on occupation, and that the skills and knowledge we acquire through years of dedicated work remain part of us even when circumstances prevent us from using them. On that night at 37,000 feet when both pilots of Flight 447 had collapsed from food poisoning and left 179 lives hanging in the balance, it had been those dormant skills emerging through a waitress uniform that saved everyone aboard and proved that heroes can be found anywhere if circumstances provide the opportunity for their light to shine through.